help. You don't bring Jack back, I'll find a way to make you do it. It's Friday.
And actually, when we came out on the stairs, there was a lot of devastation in the lobby, and actually the center of the complex, the plaza area, there was a lot of debris and some bodies. I mean, it was truly awful.
We have some shots now that we'd like to show you of what some people have described almost as a nuclear winter when they talked about the amount of soot coming down on those of you who were fleeing these buildings. Now that you've been able to absorb what happened, what's going through your head tonight? You must feel like a very lucky man.
I feel very lucky. I'm so thankful to be alive. My heart goes out to those who don't know about their loved ones or have lost loved ones, and it's still very surreal. I mean, I look down behind us and can't believe that my office building that I go to every day is gone.
Matt, before you go any further, we were just looking at shots of the countless number of New York firefighters that were on the scene. We are just getting information from a union official of some of the 400 firefighters that initially went into that area. 200 may have perished. Matt, we appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us tonight on this incredibly tragic day of our American history. Let's go back to Wolf Blitzer. Once again, Wolf, New York City officials are not confirming, nor is the Pentagon, exactly how many people were injured here or how many people died. I know Governor Pataki of New York was saying earlier this evening it will be many, many days before we have any of those numbers.
Those numbers are being collected, but I'm sure it's way too early, as you point out, Paula, to have even a rough guess how high that number will eventually go. Just to recap once again, President Bush preparing to address the nation in less than an hour or so, around 8:30 p.m. Eastern, an Oval Office address for President Bush from the White House. CNN senior White House correspondent John King is back on the North Lawn of the White House. John, you're back in the briefing room now. John, you were listening to that briefing when we went to the Capitol Hill congressional leadership statements that were being made. Was there any hard news that came out of that briefing?
Indeed, there was, Wolf. Some details on the emergency responses taking place. The Department of Health and Human Services, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, other agencies taking steps to provide medical and other disaster relief personnel, but also from the Treasury Secretary, Norman Mineta, a glimpse of what will be the near future, at least, for Americans now traveling around the country. Mr. Mineta saying as a result of this, first and foremost, that he will make the decision tomorrow if and when U.S. commercial air traffic can resume, all planes grounded at least through noon, he said, and when Americans do go to an airport or a train station in the future, they are likely to see a much higher level of security.
To increase traveler security. Travelers will indeed see increased security measures at our airports, train stations, and other key sites. There will be higher levels of surveillance, more stringent searches. Airport curbside luggage check-in will no longer be allowed. There will be more security officers and random identification checks. Travelers may experience some inconveniences, but we ask for your patience.
Now, the president is in the Oval Office with his national security team preparing for that address to the American people. About 50 minutes away from now, that address from the Oval Office. 4 members of the president's cabinet briefing here. They refuse to take any questions. White House saying that these cabinet agencies want to gather more information. Attorney General John Ashcroft vowing, though, that the perpetrators of these terrorist attacks, he said, would be discovered and punished. And again, much of the information dealing with the relief effort underway over at the Pentagon and up in New York City. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, urging Americans, no matter where they live, to donate blood. He said that is one urgent priority right now. Wolf.
Okay, John King.
And why were all of the hijacked planes California bound? One theory is that the hijackers deliberately chose planes that would have been fully loaded with fuel for a transcontinental flight. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's George Lewis tonight. Now let's go to the reaction around the rest of the country. This day of terror rippling from coast to coast. NBC's Jim Avila is at the Sears Tower in downtown Chicago. Jim?
Tom, Chicago's skyline intact but virtually empty tonight as America's skyscrapers were evacuated through most of the day today. That includes Chicago's Sears Tower, the Arco Towers in Los Angeles, the Bank of America in San Francisco, all waiting for the all clear. The nation's landmarks, America's gathering spots, today abandoned as potential terrorist targets, from the Seattle Space Needle and LA City Hall in the west, to Disney World in the southeast, to the world's biggest shopping mall, the Mall of America in Minneapolis, closed. And of course, at the country's tallest building, Sears Tower and Michigan Avenue in the Midwest, the symbols of American life frozen in fear.
It's scary. Your family's away from home, your kids at school, so it's very scary.
America hunkered down, Chicago's financial district virtually empty. Every sworn police officer in the third largest city ordered to the streets. The nation's workforce turning around and heading home. Larry Hudson works at the Sears Tower.
And I got to the elevator and I said, hey, what am I going up for?
Kelly and David McLean split up to go to work this morning and quickly decided home in front of the television set was the safest spot today.
Now this nation has turned, it's turned upside down. Emotionally, perhaps financially, who knows? It's absolutely, it's one of those moments that you can't believe you actually saw played out.
At America's 5,000 airports, total shutdown.
Ground stop for all airports until 1 o'clock. That means that no airplanes will be leaving any of the airports in the United States.
An estimated 200,000 passengers stranded. At O'Hare, world's busiest, a line of jets held on the runway for hours. No open gates, but surprisingly few complaints.
Being upset about missing my plane, that's trivial compared to people that were on the plane and in the buildings.
Military planes like this one in San Francisco escorting the last of the commercial jetliners safely to the ground. But a crippled air travel system is more than inconvenience. Aviation expert Mike Boyd.
Air transportation is part of our communication system. Today, it's shut down entirely. People aren't moving A to B. Goods aren't moving. Mail isn't moving. And because of that, we're probably going to have a tens of billions of dollar hit on our economy for this quarter.
Phone service strangled too. America's largest cell phone network, with cell towers atop the World Trade Center destroyed, reports call volume nationally doubled.
We can't compare today's events to anything that we've experienced before. We've withstood earthquakes, hurricanes, significant floods, but nothing like today's event.
Get your 12 extra right here.
In Chicago, 800 miles from the attacks, Karen Davis frustrated in her attempt to work at home.
I could not get a signal on my way home, and then I couldn't get a signal on my home phone when I got here. Just really frustrating not to be able to get in contact with anybody.
Among the events canceled tonight, Major League Baseball postponing games from coast to coast. NBC's Tonight Show called off, and the Emmys, scheduled for Sunday, canceled too.
We all could see the gravity of the situation and realize this is a true national nightmare come true, and that a celebration and a comedy show would just not be something that would be appropriate for this country this weekend.
We cannot let it happen again.
Most of the nation's schools stayed open through the tragic day, students watching terrorism on their own shores for the first time.
And I just was asking myself over and over why they did this.
Teachers trying to make sense of it.
There are other places in the world where this is commonplace, and for us it's a first.
At this hospital in suburban Chicago, Americans responding by lining up to donate blood. Midday church services more crowded than normal.
I guess I'm just looking for a peace in my heart and for peace in other people's hearts and from all the destruction.
Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
At SMU in Dallas, older students sing the national anthem at an outdoor rally, mixing tears and patriotism. Experts say Americans should expect a jump in the national anxiety level.
They may be irritable, they may be really very acutely aware of their environment around them and any kind of threats to them.
Also tonight, some of the first effects of the fear in the economic fashion. Already today, there's been problems with gas gouging. In fact, gas prices have gone up in Kansas to as much as $5 a gallon. Tom?
NBC Jim Avila tonight reporting on the length and breadth of this country, from Chicago, the heartland of America, till now we have a tracking tape. It shows the pattern of the flight that went into the first of the twin trade towers. It took off from Boston. That would be Flight 11, American Airlines. And then you can see that sharp left turn as it heads for New York, well off course. And the second plane headed now, going from New York, and then this is the second one that comes into New York. The second one goes from Newark to Pennsylvania, where it went down. There's still some uncertainty about whether that was going to be directed by the hijackers into one of the other many government or financial buildings that could have been a target for it, either in the Washington, D.C. or New York area. We don't know for sure. Of course, for many Americans tonight, the anger and the rage that they feel is directed at one man that they have never seen except on some vague videotape. Osama bin Laden, the world's best-known Islamic extremist. He's on almost everyone's list of the most likely suspects for today's attacks, and NBC's Keith Miller has more on him tonight from London for us. Keith?
Tom, he is one of the most dangerous terrorists on the planet. The U.S. government has put a $5 million bounty on his head. Osama bin Laden was last seen publicly this January at his son's wedding in Afghanistan. Rare pictures of a man who reportedly travels only at night, often in disguise, surrounded by bodyguards. He made his reputation in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
He was involved in some horrific battles, which he said later gave him a sort of tranquility and a sense of peace. And it basically made him a pretty fearless guy.
Today, the Central Intelligence Agency calls him the most immediate and serious threat to U.S. security. Bin Laden says the jihad against the United States and killing of Americans is the core of his faith. He was born into a family of wealth, power, and privilege in Saudi Arabia 44 years ago. It was during his days as a student studying economics that he turned to radical Islam. He is linked to a series of global terrorist attacks. February 1993, the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, 6 dead, more than 1,000 injured. August 7, 1998, the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, more than 200 killed. And last year, the suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, resulting in the death of 17 American servicemen.
He alone, probably within the Islamic world, has amassed and developed a terrorist network, an international network, which would be capable of carrying out such an atrocity.
After the embassy bombing, the American government retaliated with missile strikes. The missiles damaged bin Laden's headquarters in Afghanistan, but he escaped unharmed. The U.S. has demanded that the radical Islamic government in Afghanistan hand bin Laden over to American authorities. But the Afghans have refused, despite bin Laden's declaration that all U.S. citizens are legitimate targets.
He's targeted the US because he sees America as the head of the snake, as he calls it. The body of the snake is the corrupt governments in the Middle East that he has promised to overthrow, and also Israel.
Meanwhile, his popularity in the region is reportedly increasing. Recently, an estimated 25,000 followers scattered around the world and prepared to engage in a holy war against America. From Afghanistan tonight, a statement from the government claiming bin Laden didn't do it. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence officials say he was last seen near Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan, but because he moves at least 3 times a week, he will remain difficult to catch. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Keith Miller tonight. We want to give you an update now. The President of the United States will be addressing this nation on this difficult day at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight. And of course, we will bring that to you live. There are people around the world who do not wish America well. We know that as a result of today's attacks, but also on the basis of their reaction to what happened here today. Some of them are even celebrating. With that story, here's NBC's Martin Fletcher in Tel Aviv. Martin?
Tom, Israel is declaring a day of mourning tomorrow in solidarity with the United States, but not all reaction here has been so sympathetic. There's a sense here among some Palestinians that America had it coming. These Palestinians in East Jerusalem today delighted at the bombings and American loss of life, offering cakes and sweets, calling out, "God is great." Thousands more celebrate in other West Bank towns until Palestinian police disperse them. The Palestinian leader, however, stunned and sympathetic.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
But the voice of the street reflects anger at America's role, especially in Israel and Iraq.
We should show America that they should learn and they should know what is to attack somebody like Iraq. It should be more.
And many Arabs furious at American support for Israel. This man holds up an American-made bomb part fired by American-made aircraft used by Israel. American support for Israel, some believe, makes America a legitimate target for terrorism. Many also angry at years of almost daily American bomb attacks against Iraq, which didn't stop with the end of the Gulf War a decade ago. And US troops still in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden, the prime suspect in today's terror attacks, angry at American support for what he calls a tyrannical government of Saudi Arabia, his homeland, and for America's close ties with Israel. In almost a year of unrest, more than a dozen Palestinian suicide bombers and other attackers have killed 170 Israelis, while Israel has killed more than 570 Palestinians. A conflict that always threatens to suck neighboring countries into the fighting. Israel tonight called for an international war against terrorism.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life.
Today, the leader of Hamas, the Islamic militants who send most suicide bombers against Israel, called on America to change its policies. Sheikh Yassin said America is behind injustices in many parts of the world, but then he said Hamas doesn't support attacks against civilians. Tonight, Israel closed its airspace to foreign airlines and then closed its land borders to prevent any possible terrorist attacks. There's a sense here that Palestinian militants may try to take advantage of the confusion to kill more Israelis. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Martin Fletcher. An already very complex and volatile situation in the Middle East is even more so tonight. Now to a different kind of problem. The World Trade Center towers were some of the most famous buildings in the world, of course. They've survived hurricanes, fires, and even one previous terrorist bombing. NBC's Roger O'Neill talked to the architect of those buildings and how they were put up and what brought them down.
Hyman Brown was the project engineer on the Twin Towers, the man on the ground in charge of making sure the buildings were built right, the way it was designed.
There was a lot of pride in it, and we were doing something that hadn't been done before. But no one ever considered any types of forces like this.
Brown, who spent 6 years building the towers from day one in 1966, says the planes didn't cause the towers to collapse, but rather the fire and tremendous heat that exposed the steel superstructure to forces it could not withstand.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
Each tower was built around a central core. That core kept the building up, supporting the tower's so-called dead weight. But when steel melts, according to Brown, like dominoes, it falls. Brown says the towers were built to withstand 200-mile-an-hour hurricanes, the 100-year storm, the worst nature could dish out. But he says an airplane crash never entered anyone's mind. Still, it appears the outside columns, made of prefabricated steel, absorbed most of the energy from the planes and may have kept the two towers from collapsing immediately. University of Colorado engineering professor Stein Stur thinks the energy from those large planes would be equivalent to a medium 5 or 6 Richter scale earthquake.
As the airplanes came in and hit, energy was absorbed tremendously. Some of that core may have been damaged tremendously, and maybe this was part cause to this implosion.
The way the towers collapsed seems similar to pictures we've become accustomed to watching, as old buildings like the Kingdome in Seattle are taken down with explosives.
I've got the audio now.
Explosives as a catalyst to release that potential energy, converts it into kinetic energy, gets the building moving.
NBC's Roger O'Neill tonight on the stunning destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center here in Manhattan as a result of a terrorist attack. All hour long, we've been trying to bring you Rahema Ellis and her diary of what she went through during the day, and we're going to do that for you right now.
It's 11:45 in the morning, and there is a mass exodus from downtown New York City. You can take a look and you can see hundreds of thousands of people leaving the area. Police are evacuating this particular area. Were you afraid for your life?
Completely terrified. We were all crying, hysterical. We were wanting to get out of there and not knowing where to go and which direction to run in and how far we can go. And I'm still worried about my life. Yeah, it's horrifying.
Putting civilians on the bus, get on if you want. Another sign of how quickly people deserted the area. This is a fruit stand only about 8 to 10 blocks away from the World Trade Center. Normally there would be people crowded in the streets trying to buy some fruit from a man who may have worked here. Now it's deserted. Nothing is left but his fruit covered in ash. What went through your head when you saw that?
Still completely devastated, completely.
Devastation.
People jumped out of the windows. It was indescribable.
I'm watching the thing, and all of a sudden it starts crashing, this tremendous noise, and instinct obviously tells you to turn the other way and run, which we all did. People were getting trampled and bleeding.
We're now just a block away from the World Trade Center, and the closer we get to ground zero, the harder it is to breathe and to see. You have to wear a mask and you need to wear some sort of glasses, otherwise it is choking and blinding smoke. Behind me, ordinarily you would be able to see the Twin Towers, but today all you can see is the thick black smoke that is clouding the area. All on the street there is this thick ash. It's at least an inch thick. There are paper strewn all over everywhere. And the area literally is deserted, with the exception of the emergency workers who are continually trying to push people away from the area for their own safety. What do you think this is?
I have no idea.
What your guess is?
Pulverized cement.
Pulverized cement?
Concrete, yeah.
The concrete. These firefighters, just some of the hundreds, waiting for their turn to go into the World Trade Center area. Already they are covered in soot, tired, and worried about what they're going to see when they get to ground zero. What happened to you?
I was inside the building, trying to get people out when the building fell.
When do you think that we will be able to begin to go in and start to really search for some of the victims inside?
They're searching right now on a limited basis. As soon as they get organized, we'll be sending more and more people in to do more and more work.
NYU Downtown Hospital has the only emergency room in Lower Manhattan. The first victims from the blast were brought here. The cafeteria has been turned into a triage area. Hospital officials say there are victims wall to wall. 8 years ago, this hospital took in the first victims from the World Trade Center bombing. Officials here say they try to plan for disasters. 2 weeks ago, they went through an emergency drill, but no one ever imagined they'd be tested so soon. Rahema Ellis, NBC News in Lower Manhattan.
NBC's Rahema Ellis, who is in the middle of it all. We want to remind you that we'll have continuing coverage until 1 tomorrow morning on this NBC station. The President of the United States, his speech to the nation at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight. It has now been about 11 hours since the first attack on the Twin Trade Towers and the stunning sequence of events that followed. It all happened so rapidly and in plain view that it somehow seemed surreal, more a television image than the cold-blooded, calculated acts of terrorism that in fact it was. This is a day without end, for we do not know yet the full price in lives lost, whether there are other targets to come, and most important, how we will respond to this terrorist attack, how we strike back militarily, how we defend ourselves at home, how we heal all the wounds of this day. America has been attacked, and it has been changed. This is the first great test of the new century for this nation, for its new president, It's also a great test for us all, wherever we live, whatever our age, whatever our beliefs. Tonight, as we remind you, we'll have continuing coverage. We want to share with you now the images and the sounds of this unforgettably dark day in America. Hijacked planes crashing into the World Trade Center, collapsing what was once one of the tallest buildings in the world, leaving a scene some described as a nuclear winter.
In the next hour, we will bring you non-interrupted coverage of the human toll of this sneak attack. We have scores of correspondents standing by to bring you anything that breaks, and we will hear from some of the people whose lives have been altered forever. It is impossible for any news agency to convey the pain that the families of the victims are feeling tonight, even though it has been said 1,000 times, prayer and sympathy are the only things we can give them.
From Washington at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight, a little less than a half hour from now. CBS News will, of course, bring that to you live. President Bush has put the U.S. military on high alert. He vowed that the United States will find and punish whoever is behind what the president described as, quote, these cowardly acts. Early speculation centers on Osama bin Laden. In the Middle East tonight, sad to say, there are some who view today's murderously successful attacks as victories, and there was some celebrating. But
various reasons hate the United States. Much of the Arab world condemns the U.S. for its support of Israel, and there were some scattered celebrations when news of the carnage reached this part of the world. But while some Palestinian militants said America had it coming, all denied having anything to do with the attacks. Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat seemed as astonished as anyone else.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Some Israeli terrorism experts say Palestinian groups don't have the ability to carry out attacks of such magnitude and complexity. Then, of course, there's Iraq, which has its own scores to settle with the United States. But for radical Islamic fundamentalists like Osama bin Laden, who's declared a religious war against America and has carried out successful attacks in the past, the hatred of the United States runs deeper than politics.
Most Islamic groups are first and foremost interested in domestic issues. Osama bin Laden's group, on the other hand, is interested in the situation of Islam worldwide. Osama bin Laden views himself as the fighter for Islam against Western ways of life.
While the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis and the unhealed wounds of the Gulf War may fuel Osama bin Laden and his followers, their hatred of America and anything not in line with their extreme religious views is far more fundamental. David Hawkins, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
beyond the Middle East, the scope and destruction of these terrorist attacks hit home like a dagger. Governments and peoples reacted with shock and sympathy, as we hear from CBS's Richard.
Panic as Americans try to understand the scale of today's events.
From Buckingham Palace to Beijing, there was shock and sympathy. From the Vatican to the Kremlin, Russian President Putin called for a coordinated effort against terrorism. So did British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
We therefore here in Britain
stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
More than not just resting, in Britain they were rattled. Offices closing early in London's financial centre, commercial air traffic over the capital banned, as airlines here and throughout Europe cancelled transatlantic flights.
I'm certain in the short term we're going to face a much more restricted world, a world which is much more security conscious, much more anxious and much more fearful.
With European TV broadcasting live and non-stop, European governments called emergency meetings. So did NATO. Another echo of the attack in America were the questions asked here. Who was behind it and what happens now? The Taliban regime's ambassador to Pakistan today was part of the chorus calling for justice. He also insisted Osama bin Laden wasn't behind it. Bin Laden's not in contact with anyone, the ambassador insisted, and couldn't carry out such activity. It would be a great risk, he warned, for America to retaliate before completing an investigation. While Britain's calling mass terrorism a new evil the world needs to fight, some Europeans are more blunt. Germany calls the attack a declaration of war against the civilized world. But what all the allies are saying tonight is that America's not in this fight alone. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
He expresses heartfelt concern over this national tragedy. For more information, please turn to your TV news channel. In light of these events, QVC will be temporarily suspending its broadcast. You can help. Call 1-800-448-3543 to donate blood. You may also call 1-800-HELP-NOW, that's 1-800-435-7669, to donate cash by credit card. Donations may be mailed to American Red Cross, Post Office Box 37243, Washington, D.C. 20013. QVC.
As the dust cleared, me and the firemen were trying to get their gear together so that they could do their jobs, and they were all in shock. They didn't quite know what to do. How to react.
Nobody would. Now we're going to show some of your pictures here that you took of these poor people up there. Tell me, as a photographer, I mean, you've seen a lot of terrible things.
Right.
Is it hard to take a picture of somebody who's going to die in about 10 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, the first couple of jumpers that I saw, I resisted shooting them. I just didn't think it was right. I just actually didn't even think of the fact that I had a camera on me. Then after a few moments, I thought, well, this is what I'm here. I want to show. At that point, I didn't know it was terrorism. I thought it was an accident or something. I really had very little information on the ground there. And I just wanted to show kind of what was happening so that people could see it and that it wouldn't be forgotten.
When you were working and you were photographing, could you hear other people around you and the panic? And did that register while you were trying to shoot your photographs?
Well, it was eerily quiet. The policemen and the firemen were very civilized, very orderly. I think what sticks with me the most is the sprinkling of the glass as it was falling off the World Trade Center and the occasional thump of a body hitting the ground. I think that's really what sticks with me, are those sounds.
How close were you to getting hurt?
Well, at one point I was about 80 yards away from the World Trade Center. I think it was Tower 1, the one with the antenna. And a fireman yelled at me, a captain, you know, get out of here, get out of here. And I said, oh, you know, these guys have to do their job, and I left. And about 30 seconds later, I had removed myself about 100 yards. That's when the building came down onto about 2 dozen fire trucks where I had been formerly.
So you were very lucky to move when you did.
You know, I wouldn't have moved. I thought I was in a great position to get some shots where I was, unless that fire captain had said something to me.
Has that registered that you almost were killed?
Yeah, it's registered that I almost died twice, and that, you know, if that fireman hadn't said anything to me, I wouldn't be here right now.
All right. Thanks, Tom. We appreciate you coming in very much.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to go to David Lee Miller.
Other cell phone calls monitored from people. There was one unconfirmed report of a flight attendant on that first flight, the Boston flight, who called and said that the crew had been killed and that she'd been locked in the restroom, and then they didn't hear any more from her. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight. Robert, let me just catch up with you quickly. Tomorrow, we do expect that air travel will resume at noon Eastern time. But what should travelers expect in terms of security at airports?
Oh, it will be very, very strong, and I'm not sure they'll actually do it at noon Eastern time is what we've heard, but we simply said that there was not going to be, this is the FAA said, any more travel until noon tomorrow, and then they would reassess at that point. So we don't know for sure that they'll resume at noon.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. This day, it's the 11th of September, the year 2001. Some people have said the 9th month, the 11th day, 911, is a day that will be in bold print in future history books, a day that is a dark mark for this country, a day that everyone will remember where they were when they heard the news. After all, our largest city and most vital financial market immobilized, the country terrorized politically and psychologically. Dateline's Stone Phillips tonight takes us through this astonishing day, minute by minute.
Today, the unimaginable happened. At the start of a busy workday, New Yorkers heard an explosion, then looked up to see a symbol of America's economic power, one of the World Trade Center's twin towers, billowing smoke and flames.
Yeah, the glass, just flames exploded out the front of the World Trade Center. Glass flew everywhere.
Minutes later, literally from out of the blue, an even more horrifying sight. A jetliner bearing down on the other tower. It was a direct hit.
A second airplane, a 727, just rammed into the building.
Before the hour was out, the symbol of American military power, the Pentagon, was also in flames. It too apparently the target of a new weapon, a passenger jet hijacked and turned into a guided missile. Across the country, shock, sorrow, fear, outrage, and the realization that America was under attack. About 8:45 this morning, the sky over Manhattan was clear following a night of violent thunderstorms. In the city's financial of the 110-story North Tower, sudden impact.
As Matt just mentioned, we have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
1 second after the sound started, there was gray smoke and what looked to be like confetti flying all over the place.
Fire and death above, confusion below, as some 10,000 people streamed out of the building.
There was a lady had a big gash on her head, so it was people stampeding one over top of another.
Witnesses reported a horrifying scene. Desperate people jumping from the burning skyscraper. Bloody clothing and body parts scattered on the streets below. As emergency crews rushed to the southern tip of Manhattan, the immediate thought, could it really be happening again? In 1993, the same building was hit by a truck bomb, Islamic militants hoping to topple the one tower into the other. 6 people died in that attack, and 1,500 were injured. But within the first minutes today, it was clear that the toll this time would be much higher. Then, at 9:03, less than 20 minutes after the first strike, with police and rescue personnel still scrambling to respond.
Do you know
This.
if there were many people in the building?
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on this shot.
Live cameras trained on the first stricken tower captured another huge explosion, this one on the South Tower. Only this time, the attack was documented. This indelible image to be replayed again and again, seared into the American memory.
And here it comes right there.
An American Airlines 767 with 92 people on board hijacked on its flight from Boston to Los Angeles, becoming the implement of mass murder. The impact was devastating, the airliner punching through the skin of the huge tower, another rain of glass, concrete, and terror.
It's like this unbelievable ball of fire, and the whole street, which is now awakened, everyone's like, whoa. People start crying, people start running.
It was now clear that this was no accident. The first tower had also been hit by a hijacked passenger jet, a United flight that had also taken off from Boston, bound for LA. The attacks left New York virtually paralyzed. Tunnels and bridges linking the city shut down, subways closed, telephone lines jammed, cell phones overloaded as frantic callers tried to contact loved ones. At 9:30, President Bush in Florida to talk about education addressed a nation reeling and in need of reassurance.
Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
But even as the president pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible, another attack, this one even more audacious. The target, the Pentagon. Another American Airlines jet bound for Los Angeles had been hijacked, this one taking off from Washington's Dulles Airport. It was another direct hit. NBC's Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklashevsky suddenly found himself on the front lines of a war that had come home.
I don't want to alarm anybody right now, but apparently it felt just a few moments ago like there was an explosion of some kind here at the Pentagon.
9:43 a.m. With concern that the White House could be a target, President Bush boarded Air Force One bound for a special secure command post at a military base. At 9:49, the Federal Aviation Administration announced it was shutting down the nation's air traffic. In a world turned upside down, hundreds of passenger planes crisscrossing the country were now potential terrorist weapons.
The Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport.
This morning, on a scale beyond belief, Americans experienced what it's like to feel truly vulnerable, to realize when someone is willing to die for a cause, we are all potential targets. The number one suspect, this man, Osama bin Laden, a radical Islamic terrorist linked to past attacks on American interests. A London-based Arab journalist said today that 3 weeks ago, followers of bin Laden warned of a huge and unprecedented attack on the U.S. Was this it?
Somebody provided the logistical support for this operation, and clearly the only person, or one of the only people, that has built up such a network in the world today is Osama bin Laden.
There was no word from bin Laden, but the Taliban-ruled government of Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, issued a statement this morning condemning the attacks and saying bin Laden did not have the capability to carry out such acts. And there were plenty of other suspects, ranging from radical Palestinian groups to rogue governments.
President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks.
While the nation's intelligence community ran down possible suspects and tried to assess whether more attacks were imminent, rescue workers in New York and Washington confronted a disaster of immense proportions. In New York, local hospitals began filling up, urgent calls going out to every available surgeon and nurse, long lines of people outside waiting to donate blood.
It was a war zone. It's unbelievable.
And still, there was worse to come. At 9:59 a.m., the Trade Center's South Tower, the building that took the second hit, began to crumble. It was almost incomprehensible. In a matter of seconds, the skyscraper collapsed and was gone.
Suddenly, we hear, the security say, everyone get out now, everyone run for your lives.
NBC producer Shahar Baran was there with a home video camera.
A bunch of women just standing there, shocked. By then, the whole building sort of implodes. It just goes like this. And you see like a side of the building, and then it goes, and there's this ball, this silver yellow ball sort of heading towards you, kind of in slow motion. You can't figure out what to do. People are starting to run like crazy.
If you take a look behind.
Then at 10 a.m., news of another passenger plane in trouble. Someone on United Airlines Flight 93, traveling from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, called 911 and reported a hijacking. Then an explosion and silence. The plane crashed here, some 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. There were 45 people on board. So far, 3 passenger jets used kamikaze style, and a 4th that might have been. 266 people on board killed. The death toll on the ground still unclear. Then, at 10:30, another sickening sight. The tower still standing, following its twin, collapsing, vanishing in a cloud of smoke. By 11 o'clock, the sense of alarm had spread across the country. Troops standing guard as national landmarks were shut down. Fighter jets actually patrolling the skies as the last airborne passenger planes rushed to safety. 11:14, officials trying to manage the disaster, struggling to describe it all.
First of all, Chief, do we have any idea of how many people are in there?
We have no idea. Now, as you know, it was pretty much rush hour time that this took place this morning, so the numbers we don't know yet. We tried to get almost everybody out that we could early on.
10,000 people in each tower would typically be in there on a normal business day, and we get about another 5,000 visitors during the course of the entire day. So by 8:30, 9 o'clock, the building should have been full.
And New Yorkers were struggling too.
And now they both collapsed. There's no more World Trade Centers.
At 11:42, another plane from Boston declared an emergency. Fearing a bomb on board, it landed in Cleveland. Soon, all planes in Canada as well as the U.S. were grounded. The borders with Mexico and Canada were sealed, and Major League Baseball announced the cancellation of all games scheduled for today. At 1:12, President Bush, at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, again spoke to the nation.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Moments after his speech, the president reboarded Air Force One for a then undisclosed location. Meanwhile, in New York, an army of rescue workers and volunteers from the city's building trades and other unions made their way to the wreckage of Lower Manhattan, seeking the injured and dead.
You guys going back?
Yes. It's our job.
You worried about that other tower?
Personally, I am. I got fellow officers that might be trapped. Not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
Those civilians who could made their way by foot across the Brooklyn Bridge, as New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani called for calm in a city that was more shell-shocked than terrified.
And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal.
The mayor's news conference gave the first hint of just how high the casualty count could be.
There are over 1,000 rescue workers, probably about 2,000 that are deployed, trying to get into the buildings, trying to find people, trying to search for people. The governor and I spoke a couple of hours ago. The governor has deployed the National Guard to relieve them because our people are going to need reinforcements pretty soon.
Just before 3 p.m., President Bush landed at Offutt Air Force Base outside of Omaha. From an underground bunker at the Strategic Air Command Base, he convened a National Security Council briefing. As 4 o'clock approached, the president's spokesperson, Karen Hughes, briefed reporters back in Washington.
The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington.
5:21 p.m. Even as people around the country struggled with the enormity of today's events, a third building at the World Trade Center, damaged by this morning's attacks, collapsed.
They advised us to leave because we have... Oh my God. Look behind us, please pan in this way, please. Be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No.
Fortunately, the building with more than 40 floors had been evacuated. But once again, the concrete canyons of Lower Manhattan were filled with the sounds of sirens and the sight of people fleeing for their lives.
That's Stone Phillips with a riveting account of all that happened today. And what you see behind me is the scene in Lower Manhattan tonight, live as the rescue efforts do continue. So does the fire and the smoke. 3 buildings now have been collapsed as a result of this terrorist attack today. Let's go to NBC's Pat Dawson, who's been on duty there all day long as we await the President of the United States. Pat, very quickly, bring us up to date on recovery efforts.
The recovery efforts at this point, Tom, still pretty much the bottom line is this is a rather chaotic situation here. New York City Fire Department Lieutenant was just giving us some information a few minutes ago and said that there are still fires burning down there, still some underground fires. He told us that there was a rather significant fire in that building that Stone was just describing, number 7 World Trade Center, that collapsed late in the afternoon. As he said, there are still fires burning there. They are trying at this point to get to those fires and to extinguish them, as well as the task, obviously, of looking for anyone who might possibly have survived, although at this point that is a very, very difficult thing to do in the darkness and not able to evacuate. Tom?
All right, thank you, Pat Dawson, bringing us up to date on the rescue efforts that continue underway as we look at the scenes that have been described all day long by so many people who were there either as a war zone or reminiscent of a nuclear winter. The President of the United States will address the nation, presumably from the Oval Office tonight, after certainly the most hectic day of his presidency, one of the most difficult days of any modern president. He began in Florida earlier, went to Shreveport, addressed the nation from there at Barksdale Air Force Base, then to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, to the very secure bunker with all the most sophisticated communications equipment in the world at his disposal for a meeting of the national security. Appearance tonight on the steps of the Capitol of the House and Senate members who were still in town, Republican and Democrat alike, the leaders. There they are, and after their statement by their leaders, they broke into this spontaneous rendition of God Bless America.
The president isn't sitting there trying to think about what to say, I can assure you. The president is sitting there because someone on network television has sat him down and said, we'll cue you in 30 seconds, Mr. Bush. And so as awkward as it looks to him, this is what we've expected him to do. And now here he is.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
The President of the United States, when he is in many respects needed most. And we've been joined by George Stephanopoulos, who's been downtown all day and who very quickly picked up, George, that the President may have given us a hint in his first couple of lines there to the magnitude of this.
He said thousands of lives that were suddenly ended. The first number we've had all day by an official verifying the magnitude of the casualties. Thousands of lives suddenly ended. He also did a lot of other things in this very short speech, Peter. He gave voice to the anger that many Americans are feeling. He talked about the quiet, unyielding anger of America, and then was very pointed in giving reassurance. Military is prepared. The emergency teams are on their way. Government will be back to business tomorrow. We'll be back to business tomorrow. And then finally, Peter, what I found most interesting in the section about where he talked about retaliation, he said America would make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them, which is a message to any state which may be supporting these terrorists who are behind this act.
Well, which creates a huge dilemma for the United States of America, because if it is discovered, as we've talked several times throughout the day, that a state, and I've forgotten who it was, a former director of the CIA perhaps earlier today, who said he couldn't believe that a state would actually support Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA, who said directly he couldn't believe that a state would actively support an act such as this, though it may have over periods of time, as Iran and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan have all been suspected to do, give collateral or indirect support down through the years.
The word that the president used was so expansive, Peter. It wasn't just supported or funded. It was any who harbored them. who may have given them sanctuary at any time. That is a very open-ended commitment.
And then I thought, by the way, also, if I may add, that this president particularly, who feels so strongly about his Christianity, felt it a good time to say, to quote those lines from Psalm 23, even though I walk, or yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil, because God is with me. And that will just sit so appropriately, I believe, in the minds and the sentiments of many Americans tonight. And we felt throughout the day, we heard scattered reports of people going to churches and saying a prayer for those people who may or may not be lost, and for the families of those people around the country. Because don't forget, relatives in these locations have relatives all over the country.
That the Congress will give the intelligence community both the power it needs and the money it needs, and that the Congress will give the Defense Department the authority and the resources to do whatever it takes.
All right, let me stop you there.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm not getting you.
Me now, Mr. Speaker?
Mr.
I hear you
Speaker,
now.
Shepard Smith in New York, I believe we've lost Bill O'Reilly's connection. He's picking up on the conversation.
Very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
Come on, guys, keep moving.
I was walking to work, and all of a sudden, I see a jet crash into the first tower.
An American Airlines flight loaded with 92 people crashes head-on into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
And then we heard the crash, we ran to the window.
Into the building, it went into the Trade Center.
It hit the Trade Center, we saw the shrapnel fall, and then we said, get out.
And minutes later,
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit.
I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up, and I saw the second plane hit.
a second commercial plane, a United Airlines jet, also hijacked, carrying 65 people, plows into the South Tower.
First one we thought was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism.
On the ground, witnesses could not believe their eyes.
Now, General Schwarzkopf.
No question about it. No question about it. But I, just like everyone else, was delighted to hear that statement about going after those people who harbor these terrorists, too. That applies not only to the people abroad, but people in our own country who do that.
General Schwarzkopf, we have the mightiest military in the world, but we are facing an entirely different kind of enemy now. That's very plain today in the pain and grief that this country is feeling. Are we going to have to realign our military forces?
I don't think we need to realign them, Tom. We have the capability to strike. The question we're going to have difficulty with is finding them. Number one, identifying them, and then number two, finding them and being able to attack them where we find them.
Have you been surprised that despite all the warnings about the vulnerability of this country to terrorism, that both among ordinary people and even in the highest echelons of Congress, people have refused in some sense to take it all very seriously?
Well, you know, we've always had those two great oceans on either side of us to protect us and sort of isolate us from the rest of the world, and they've always been a sort of a sanctuary for us. And with the world getting smaller and smaller due to international transportation and that sort of thing, those are no longer walls that protect us anymore. We need to come to the realization, and you know, terrorism has been alive and well throughout the rest of the world for a very, very long time, and you can point to it in many different places, and it's come to our shores big time now. We need to understand that.
I know that you still have many contacts in the Arab world among the moderate Arab states. Do you think that they will be willing to stand beside the United States now in a conspicuous fashion against this kind of terrorism?
That's going to be very, very tough for them to do. Very, very tough, because, of course, in doing so, the terrorists have always justified their acts against any United States facility because of what the United States support of Israel. And quite frankly, for them to stand up now and support the United States 100% is going to put them in a very, very difficult position with vis-a-vis Israel, because most of those states are anti-Israel.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who's with us tonight as well. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke did make a very appropriate point, because the reaction in this country will be, in many quarters, to lash out at all people of Islamic faith, all practicing Muslims. And there are about 7 million in this country altogether, many of them in the Detroit area, but also throughout the eastern seaboard. as well. That would be a grievous error on the part of the United States, because many of these Islamic countries have been the targets of the same kind of terrorism. Egypt particularly, and Saudi Arabia has not been happy with some of the attacks that have been made in that country as well. These are people who operate like loose bands of guerrillas, and they have their own kind of demented and perverted view of what the Islamic faith is all about, and they attempt to gain their revenge against what they describe as their satanic enemies like the United States through these kinds of acts of cowardly terrorism. The Islamic faith is the fastest growing faith in the world, and it's one that cannot be ignored by this country in so many different dimensions. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklaszewski now, who's at the Pentagon. Jim, we know that American military forces are on worldwide alert of the highest order tonight. Anything else for us?
Well, officials here at the Pentagon also at the highest state of alert, Delta, which is essentially virtually at a war footing, Tom, where American military are supposed to be geared up, weapons locked and loaded, ready for absolutely everything. But it's been a full 11 hours since that American Airlines 757 slammed into the Pentagon, and firefighters are having a very difficult time with the stubborn blaze. As you can see behind me now, what were just a couple of flickers on the roof are actually now full-blown infernos, apparently. Flames bursting through the roof, even more so just in the last few minutes as we've been standing here watching, and much further away now than the original fires that we had watched several hours ago. So it appears that the fires here in the Pentagon are not only stubborn, but spreading. At the same time, television crews were permitted in the area just a short time ago, and they recorded a very grisly scene, Tom. What they first saw were some of the dead that had been removed from the rubble, covered in sheets. There's a temporary morgue actually set up in the center courtyard of the Pentagon here. The exact casualty toll still not known, but scores are believed to be dead and still buried underneath the rubble. And there was also some shots of the damage, exterior damage around the building itself. As you can see from the pictures, it's eerily reminiscent, Tom, of the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. The wide gash in the building and the slanted floors that had just collapsed under their own pressure, and it appears that these rescue workers are a long way from not only containing the blaze, but recovering the victims, Tom.
I find that stunning, Jim Miklaszewski, that they've had all day to work on that blaze. It tells you about the very grievous nature of this attack on that building, that they still have flames at this hour burning through the military headquarters of the United States.
Well, actually, Tom, some consider the location where this plane went in rather fortunate, because exactly where the plane went in was an area that had recently been redeveloped and redesigned with very heavy blast walls and firewalls in that new area there. Of course, can't withstand the kind of impact of a 757. So as you look at the building, the fire did not spread very much to the right, the new portion of the building, and the old portion where the fire continues to spread, much of that had already been vacated. Those offices vacated in preparations of the remodeling effort that was to be undertaken in that section of the building. Even though the death toll here is likely to still rise significantly, the number of dead is probably considerably less than it would have been if this part of the Pentagon had been up to full staff. Tom?
And Jim, a lot of people are going to be looking at all that destruction and wonder whether our military capability is in any way compromised by the damage to the building here.
Well, fortunately, too, this is exactly the opposite side of all the critical command centers in the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense's office, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs office, the National Military Command, the tank, you've been there, Tom, where some of the most critical military decisions are made. Fortunately, they were all on the other side of the building, And Secretary Rumsfeld never left the building today. After surveying some of the damage, actually helping some of the injured out on stretchers, he returned not to his office, but the National Military Command Center to coordinate any kind of military assessments and operations that may be underway. Tom, one indication that some plans are already being considered. 2 aircraft carriers were recently in the Persian Gulf, the Enterprise, the Carl Vinson. The Enterprise had left the Persian Gulf, was scheduled to leave the area, head home, and the Navy has told, the Pentagon has told the Enterprise, stay right where you are.
Jim, we do know that the Air Force One had a fighter plane escort when it returned today from the Omaha to Washington leg. Do you think that that might be routine for the foreseeable future?
I would guess that probably will be routine. I mean, we saw the extraordinary scene over here earlier today of American fighter jets, F-16, flying low-level cover over the Capitol and the Pentagon. And I think there will be extraordinary security measures, not only implemented around this building, and they had been stiffened just recently, Tom. All the outside windows have been equipped with Kevlar coating to guard against blast. This portion of the building that have been remodeled, heavy blast walls put in. So they were in the process of trying to make this building terror-proof. It was proven today that that may never be possible.
All right, thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky, who is at the Pentagon tonight. Now let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell, who covers the diplomatic front and national security matters for us as well. Colin Powell, is he back in the nation's capital tonight, Andrea?
Yes, he is back. He had cut short his trip to South America, flew directly from Lima, Peru, back to Washington, and is now at the State Department. He went to meetings with his top team. They were waiting there on the 7th floor of the State Department for him. So he came back without going to Bogota, Colombia. But intelligence officials and others are all, as you know, mobilizing to try to find the culprits. U.S. officials have briefed some members of Congress. What we're learning now from Senator Orrin Hatch, who's a key member of the Judiciary Committee, is that they did have intelligence intercepts. So after the attack, they did pick up some intercepts, and you know the sophistication of the National Security Agency and their ability to intercept communications worldwide, and they zero in, they target bin Laden's operation routinely. They picked up intercepts with some members of his organization apparently referring to these targets having been hit. They've been successful in the past building cases against bin Laden by picking up this kind of information, these kinds of communications. They also believe that at least one person on one of the 4 doomed flights may have been a member of his organization. So as disastrous as this is, they will have leads from people checking into airports, checking on those flights. They know some of the pseudonyms, the aliases, the fake identifications that are used by some of these people. They've probably got a pretty good head start tonight. George Tenet and his officials are all gathered at the CIA in secure areas and are having meetings as we speak.
Andrea Mitchell, are you picking up anything about sending emissaries around the world in an effort to build what has been described as an extraordinary coalition of people to try to build an alliance against the idea of terrorism? Because it's not just the Western democracies that are being threatened by all of this, but as you well know, many of the moderate Arab states have been targets as well.
And as Dick Holbrooke and General Schwarzkopf were talking to you earlier, it's very clear that we are at a very weak moment diplomatically in the Arab world and in the Gulf region. Our best allies, including Saudi Arabia, top leaders have been blunt in telling President Bush and communicating privately with his father, who is, of course, very popular in that area, and talking to other U.S. officials about how displeased they are about the situation with the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians. So there is very little support. Bin Laden is a hero, is in many ways an idol to many people on the street in the Palestinian areas. So while we have to be very careful to make those distinctions with Islamic fundamentalists who have nothing at all to do with Osama bin Laden, to radicals in the region, he is a hero. And he will, of course, be made more of a hero if and when the U.S. retaliates. And as both of your other guests were saying earlier, there is no question in anyone's mind the U.S. is going to retaliate not only against bin Laden, because they don't even know exactly where he is, but most assuredly against the Taliban if they can nail down the evidence that he was responsible, because there's no question that the Taliban have been warned. The U.S. is going to retaliate against Afghanistan itself.
NBC's Andrea Mitchell, thank you very much. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who covers the aviation beat for us. And of course, today we did have the fully unexpected and shocking development of these terrorists hijacking 4 airliners simultaneously, 2 American Airlines, 2 United Airlines jetliners bound for California from Boston, Newark, and Washington Dulles. 2 of them going into the World Trade Center, 1 going into the Pentagon, and another crash landing and killing everyone on board outside of Pittsburgh. This was a well-planned, very cold-blooded, extremely well-executed terrorist attack, Robert, and we have been talking tonight about whether we'll have a resumption of air flight in this country anytime tomorrow. This is one more of the exceptional developments. No airplanes were flying after about noon today.
They were talking about resuming flights at noon tomorrow. They say at least that they'll reassess it at that point. And meantime, there's also some new information now that maybe the weapon of choice here seems to have been knives. We know now that there were knives involved on at least 3 of the 4 aircraft that were hijacked and brought down. And there's been no mention yet of anything about guns being used. But first, let's look at the facts of these crashes today. The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board, supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too, taken over, and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane had made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only 2 ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun at his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this.
And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights, 1 from a flight attendant and 2 from passengers that were on board the flights. And they all talk about knives. There's, again, no mention of guns. In the first case, it was that flight that came out of Boston, and that was an American Airlines flight, and it was a flight attendant who apparently got a cell phone call off. I've heard variously it was to American Airlines operations or maybe somewhere else, but she reported that her fellow attendants had been stabbed in the back of the plane, and that the cabin had been taken over, and up front that the crew of the plane had been taken over, and that the plane was going down in New York, was the quote that we heard. Then, on the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day, that was 17 minutes behind that first flight, and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father. In the first call, he told his father that a flight attendant had been stabbed and the plane had been hijacked. Then the phone went dead. Then he got another call off to his father and said the plane was going down. So that, again, is a plane that went into the second Twin Tower of the World Trade Center. On the third flight of the day to be hijacked, the one that left from Dulles Airport, was supposed to go to San Francisco, instead was taken over, looped around, brought back to the Pentagon. It was Barbara Olson, the CNN commentator and Washington lawyer and the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who called her husband Theodore twice from the plane before it went down. I'm sorry, I think she called once, but she talked about knife-like instruments being used by the hijackers in the back of the plane, and said that passengers had been forced to the back of the plane. Anyhow, all this talk about knives might suggest that something managed to get through X-rays, and maybe it was thought by the terrorists that it would be easier to get knives through the X-ray machines and not be caught at it than to get guns through. At any rate, we may hear differently later, but so far there's been no mention of guns. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Robert Hager tonight with a complete wrap-up of the aviation component of all of this. No one could have anticipated that hijacked planes would be used, in effect, as guided missiles, although Tom Clancy, in one of his very popular books, did have a hijacked plane crashed into the U.S. Capitol. There have been other attempts in the past by other terrorists. You'll remember that there was an attempt to take some planes out of the Philippines and blow them up over the Pacific after the capture of the terrorists who were responsible for the original bombing of the World Trade Center. And there have been other planes as well. An Air India flight was blown up in midair, to say nothing of Pan Am 103, which was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland, by terrorists widely believed that they were from Libya, and they have gone on trial, obviously, and that killed a great many Americans on that flight as well. So it's not the first time that this has happened, but it's never been used in quite this fashion before. And if you have been impatient with airline and airplane security in the past, wait until there's a resumption of flights. There's going to be a great change in this country. If you fly in the Middle East or through many parts of Europe, you're often several times questioned before you can get on the flight, as well as all the electronic security that you have to go through. You have to get to the airport well in advance of the scheduled departure time of the plane, and those will be some of the new procedures that are bound to be put into effect in this country. El Al, in fact, has undercover people on board, armed, trained sharpshooters who fly on all their international flights. It could come to that in America. One former State Department official was saying today we may even have to have some form of air cover in America, hard as that is to believe. But as you look at these scenes, you know the consequences of not having very tight security at our airports. Let's go to Pat Dawson now, who has been keeping track for us of the rescue efforts downtown and of the fires that continue to burn in Lower Manhattan. Pat?
Tom, we are getting to the point of, I guess, what is best described as an unofficial shift change. We have seen for about the past half hour a number of New York City firefighters principally leaving here, leaving the scene, moving out, along with their vehicles. In many cases, those vehicles in total disarray, seriously damaged. We were able to grab one of them to speak to us. This is firefighter.
Some activity in these skies throughout the day. Fighter jets have been patrolling the air around Washington, and as we understand it, their orders are quite clear. If a plane enters restricted airspace and cannot be urged out, then it will be shot down. Peter?
Adrian, still reports from New York tonight that they're having an awful time trying to get towards the rubble to do any kind of rescue operation that may still be possible because they're still fighting fires and still trying to cap gas leaks. What about at the scene of the crash at the Pentagon? What's the latest from there tonight?
Well, earlier we had believed that it was starting to calm down, but recently we've been seeing pictures of flames coming from the Pentagon. So there is a sense that it's not getting better. It might just be getting worse, that the fire within the building itself might be spreading. Whether that's because of the jet fuel or some other cause, we're not clear on yet. We do believe that most of the people who were in the Pentagon have now left the building, but we don't yet know why the fires are burning.
All right, Adrian Arsenault reporting to us tonight from Washington. U.S. President George Bush was not in Washington at the time of the Pentagon attack, but as you may have seen, he is there now. And he's assuring the nation that while a powerful symbol of the U.S. government may have been attacked, the government itself is still operating smoothly. With more on the president's response to this Tuesday of terror, here's the CBC's David Holton. David.
Well, Peter, some are already describing this as the cruelest day in U.S. history. A day that, in a sense, shattered a nation's sense of its own security.
Ready? Kite. Yes, kite. Get ready.
It's just after 9 a.m. President Bush is at an education event when an aide gives him the first whispered news of the New York bombings. His face clouds with anxiety.
At the count of 3, everyone should be on page 1.
Minutes later, his first official response.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
For more than 3 hours, though, as U.S. forces at home and abroad are put on the highest alert, nothing more is heard from Bush or any other senior official. Public fears aren't eased when Bush flies to an Air Force base in Louisiana, apparently still unsure that it would be safe to return to Washington.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
A terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation, but has befallen...
More words of defiance from Secretary of State Colin Powell on a visit to Peru.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
As thousands flee downtown Washington,
clear down the whole area.
There's confusion, shock, and disbelief.
We can't move. We can't get anywhere. Everybody's concerned that there might be other buildings targeted.
Now I know what my parents felt like on Pearl Harbor Day.
It's really inconceivable to us that someone would do that, and so you really can't understand the enemy.
But in this case, was the enemy Osama bin Laden? U.S. officials already say bin Laden is their prime suspect, that only his terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, has the resources and sophistication to carry out today's coordinated attacks. But in Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, representatives of the Taliban government denied that he's involved.
We strongly condemn it. We want investigation to be carried out.
We could hear detonations coming from that northern area as well.
Later, explosions and rocket fire lit up the night sky around the Afghan capital. Washington quickly denied that this was a U.S. retaliation attack and said the fighting was started by Afghan rebels.
In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
This evening, Bush returned to the White House after an unexplained visit to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. This was part of his address to the nation tonight.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Bush also ordered federal departments to reopen tomorrow, obviously wanting to send a signal that the government here won't be knocked off course by the bombings. But, no one has any illusions here that it may be a long time before Americans feel safe again. Peter?
David, in a city that can be so often split in a nasty way by partisan matters, what is the sense of unity there in Washington tonight?
Tremendous show of solidarity on Capitol Hill all afternoon, Peter. The Democrats rallying behind, saying they will rally behind President Bush. How long will that last for? That's the issue. Already questions are being asked about why 4 hijackings could take place. What about airport security? Also, and perhaps more patently, why there appears to have been a huge intelligence failure in the fact that even officials here are openly admitting now that they had no advance warning of today's attacks.
All right, David Holton reporting for us tonight from Washington. The shockwaves from today's horror traveled to Ottawa, putting the national capital on alert. Prime Minister Chrétien appealed for calm and said the government had beefed up security here just in case. And he offered the U.S. Canada's sympathy and whatever help it needs. Here's Paul Hunter.
It didn't take long for the effect of the attack to be felt in Ottawa. Heightened security was everywhere. Police doubled their numbers on the streets just in case something were to happen here. At the U.S. Embassy, the biggest and most important American building in Canada, all non-essential workers were told to go home.
Sir, can we get your reaction to what's going on inside?
No comment right now. Thank you.
Those who worked nearby wondered, could the U.S. Embassy be a target?
I'm really scared. I want to go as far away from here as possible.
The Prime Minister heard about the attack during a breakfast in Ottawa with Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert.
We have talked with the RCMP, with the Solicitor General and the head of the RCMP, and with the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and everybody has increased the level of security everywhere.
Planes on the way in. That was made clear in the sky above Whitehorse this afternoon. Canadian fighter jets tracked a Korean plane when there were fears of a possible hijacking. It turned out the plane was simply having fuel troubles, having circled for too long. Those in charge of Canadian security said they were indeed doing all they could.
We have a very strong security intelligence teams in the U.S. and in this country. Obviously, there's been a desperate, terrifying act of terrorism that we will all have to deal with.
I can assure you we are doing everything possible to gather the very best intelligence so that we can use that intelligence to respond appropriately to whatever threat there is to Canadians and obviously other embassies and so on in Canada.
Even so, the Israeli embassy in this Ottawa office building was evacuated anyway, as were all Israeli embassies around the world. Here, nearby office workers were sent home early too, just in case.
Just sheer relief fell over the whole office, you know.
Relief in the end that nothing terrible happened here.
And all I can tell you is that this was a day when, as soon as people found out you were an American, they turned to you with expressions of grief, expressions of horror, expressions of outrage, and an offer to do anything they could do to help, which in my case meant getting a little bit closer to New York or Washington. Peter?
Ted, have you managed, I totally sympathize with what you've gone through today, and as bad as a day it is for many Americans, I understand what you mean when you say it's been a good day to be reminded that people around the world admire and sympathize with Americans, suffer with it. Can you give us some sense, if you have any whatsoever, just from looking at the reporting there, as to how governments are responding as well as individuals?
Well, again, Peter, and you've been in this situation often enough to be sympathetic to it. I literally just landed in London. We had to charter from Paris to get over here because flying into Heathrow wasn't that easy, especially at this time of night. And have only landed now and been reading the wires in the car coming in. And I do know that Tony Blair has expressed strong condemnation and, of course, a sense of oneness with the United States. Perhaps, Peter, the most interesting thing that I've heard and just read a little bit of a transcript of a television newscast that came out of Tehran earlier this evening is that the Iranian president, Khatami, is quoted by Iranian anchors earlier this evening as expressing his outrage and offering to help in any way that he can against this form of worldwide.
15 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow.
The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still two hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the fourth plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the four-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here. Everything was running fine on the plane, it sounded like.
Authorities now say tonight 285 people, it seems, died aboard the airliners. And tonight all flights remain grounded all across the country. Now the FAA officials say they may reopen the national airspace tomorrow afternoon, but then again they may not. In any case, when the flights do resume, we're told we'll see an unprecedented level of security for U.S. aviation. But even then, it will not be an aviation system that's very well equipped to prevent suicide attacks. Dan?
Bob Orr live in Washington. 285 now, the number of people aboard the hijacked planes and presumed dead. Dateline Tokyo, stocks in Tokyo plunged early Wednesday morning. Traders dumped shares at least partially, if not mostly, in reaction to the terrorist attacks. And Dateline New York City at this hour, a story that will make your spine tingle and the hair raise up on the back of your neck. Authorities say a Munhall, Pennsylvania woman called 911 shortly before 8 p.m. tonight, New York time, saying her brother was, quote, still trapped under 40 feet of rubble near the Forward Hotel in Manhattan. That's in the area where the World Trade Center's buildings collapsed. The 911 coordinator says the victim told his sister he was still trapped under the World Trade Center wreckage. He gave specific directions to where he was located and said he was there with 2 New York City police sergeants and was calling for help. They declined to release the name of the woman, and authorities in New York said they are aware of this report of survivors. Can they get to them in the rubble where they are buried? And if so, can they get to them soon enough? A reminder, you are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Now, we'll be back after a little bit. We give you that break for our stations up and down the line, and we'll give another break shortly on. During this minute, let us say to you that we know that there are 285 people aboard the hijacked planes. The belief is they are dead. The numbers of dead in the World Trade Center disaster area unknown, and it may be unknown for days, although Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has said from mid-morning that we should be prepared for very large casualties. A union firefighters official said that perhaps as many of 200 firefighters may be dead because many of them rushed to the scene immediately when the first plane cracked into the first World Trade Center building. And, well, his speculation was that as many as 200 may be dead. Unquestionably, some New York police and firefighters have lost their lives. We know not how many. At last report, dozens of New York City police officers were missing. Now, again, a reminder for our stations, you're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Back now at CBS News World Headquarters in New York. CBS's special coverage of the attack on America continues, as it will throughout the evening and early morning and into tomorrow. The headlines at this hour. Addressing the nation from the White House tonight, President Bush said thousands of lives were suddenly ended, unquote, in the multiple terror attacks in New York City, the nation's capital, and Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon included on that list. President Bush said bluntly, the United States will not distinguish between the terrorists who actually committed the acts and what he called But there is every effort being made to show now that the government is still up and running, as Bob Schieffer reports to us now. Bob?
Afghanistan, you look for them, you bomb, what do you do?
I don't think America can be a paper tiger in this instance. This was a major attack, and let's face it, there isn't going to be chaos. We're not going to bend down. We are going to rise up as one people. And it's got to be stopped, and you have to ferret it out. I agree with what Dick Holbrooke said on this network earlier. You've got to work with our allies, the NATO allies, particularly Russia, China, and the moderate Arab countries. That's Egypt, that's Jordan, that's the Saudis. And we have to make a statement that is so strong that any country that harbors, that trains, that gives money to, that supports, becomes an enemy of the civilized world. Because if this can happen here, it can happen in other places. Terrorism, as our report will say very shortly, isn't a crisis, it's an ongoing condition. And we've got to change the condition. So I must say, I feel very strongly about this, that the United States must respond. Those of us that have had the classified briefings over a period of time understand some of the networks that are functioning out there, even in this country, as a matter of fact. And it's not too difficult to put together 2 and 2, and I think get 4.
All right.
Larry,
Senator Thompson?
Can I just say that Putin was one of the first heads of state to call our president. And the Secretary of Defense this afternoon, colleagues, I was there when he talked with the Russian defense minister. That's an example of the type of support we're getting. The world has got to come and help us solve this problem, because terrorism is a common enemy to all of us.
And Senator Thompson, if the state that harbors them is as responsible as those who commit it, therefore are those civilians in peril?
Yes, they are. The powers that be in those nations have put them in peril. Saddam uses his civilians, as we know. There's no way around that, but we've got to face up to it. I agree with Diane that the greatest deterrent that we can have is the knowledge in the minds of potential terrorists around the world that there will be swift, accurate retribution. Unfortunately, there's just no way around that.
And Larry, could I just
Thank you. We're out of time, but we'll do a lot more with you in the nights ahead with all 4 of you and others. Secretary William Cohen, the former Secretary of Defense, will be joining us. As we go to meet him, there was an extraordinary scene on the Capitol steps tonight. Look at what happened. Watch.
As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts.
Person watching this the world over was shocked to see the act of terror actually being perpetrated on the screen, and the horror that we all witnessed. Was I surprised? The answer is no. We have known for some time that Osama bin Laden and other organizations have targeted the United States abroad and at home. We formed the so-called Hart-Rudman Commission several years ago, and they filed 3 reports, the last of which was quite prophetic, indicating that we should anticipate acts of terrorism on American soil by terrorists who may in fact use weapons of mass destruction and engage in nearly simultaneous types of multiple attacks. And so it doesn't come as a surprise. It comes as a surprise or shock to see the horror that we have witnessed today. But we have got to take more measures. I agree with much of what has been stated this evening, but we also have to take care that we don't engage in the wholesale slaughter of innocents abroad. We have to go after those groups and those who support those groups in terms of our responses.
So we don't go in and bombs away. What do we do?
Well, first of all, we have to make sure we have the right information. And we don't want to prejudge the matter, although those footprints of guilt would seem to lead in one very certain direction. I think we go to those who are harboring the suspected groups and serve them notice. I think President Bush did that very forcefully tonight. And that they must produce those individuals, and certainly they will face a number of consequences, and I don't think we have to spell them out. There will be certainly diplomatic, economic, and perhaps even military action. but we should await for the President and his national security team to deliver that particular message.
You worked there for a long time. Were you a little surprised that the Pentagon wasn't better protected?
Well, the Pentagon, as you note from its proximity to the airport, really cannot be better protected in terms of aircraft flying near the airport and passing over the Pentagon itself. It's been one of my worst nightmares over the years to be out on the parade ground or in my office and know that at any time a plane could, through either accidentally or be directed into the Pentagon itself. There is virtually no way that one can protect the Pentagon against that type of attack unless you banned all flights going into National itself, but even that might not be sufficient. So it's almost impossible to protect against an airplane engaging that type of activity.
What do we do about a bin Laden? We've heard the name, we've seen him occasionally. He's obviously been involved in acts of terrorism over the year, but what do you do about someone like this?
I think the first thing that we should resist doing, and that is focusing solely on him. To the extent that he is responsible, he will be held accountable and he will receive just punishment. But there may be other bin Ladens out there, and there'll be more following. What we have to do is to eliminate the climate under which they're allowed to train, to be funded, and to perpetrate these acts. Senator Warner talked about President Putin calling President Bush today. I was in Moscow a year ago when one of the bombs went off, destroying one of their buildings. I went on national television pledging the United States to work hand in hand with the Russian people because they were being terrorized. And so this is an international problem. We have to gather our allies and say, this transcends all borders. When America is wounded, the rest of the world bleeds as well. And what happens here can have a dramatic impact on the life and the lifestyles of so many the world over. So we are in this together, and every American is in this together. Much like we came together after Pearl Harbor, we're coming together now, and we will respond as one nation.
And Mr. Secretary, it must be asked, how did they get on these airplanes?
Well, that's to be determined. Obviously, they were able to slip through the security. They may have had inside assistance. You may have had a situation in which bin Laden or another group has been placing sleepers for a year or so or less. We don't know exactly, having assistance to allow them to get on. There are many ways in which that could have happened, but that's going to have to await the investigation itself by the FBI and others.
Thank you very much, good friend. Always good seeing him. Not under these circumstances, though. William Cohen, the former Secretary of Defense. In a moment, we're going to talk with Tim O'Brien, the CNN correspondent, close friend of the Olson family, as was this program. Barbara Olson passed away today on American Air Flight 77. Brian Jenkins with us in Los Angeles, the terrorism expert. And Arthur Woke, the famed attorney who has done a lot of work involving aviation and who is, we understand, an angry man tonight. Before we check in with Tim and Brian and Arthur, tonight on the Capitol steps, the members of House and Senate gathered. Watch this.
Take beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Ted Olson is the Solicitor General of the United States. You know him very well from the many, many appearances he made before the United States Supreme Court and the Florida Supreme Court in the question over the election of Bush over Gore. His wife was Barbara Olson, who appeared on this program so many times in the last 4 weeks, almost every night. Barbara Olson was on American Air Flight 77 that left Dulles, bound for Los Angeles, and crashed into the Pentagon. I spoke to Ted Olson today briefly, and it was just sad, so sad to speak to someone who had just lost his wife. Another gentleman who spoke to him was a much closer friend to the Olson family. He's Tim O'Brien, CNN correspondent. He called Ted on the phone. We understand, Tim, that you were at their wedding.
I was in their wedding. I was also out at his house this afternoon along with a number of other friends. It was a very sad afternoon.
Now, I know he told us she called him, but he went into detail with you. What happened during that call? This is the only information we have on these terrorists.
She was able to call him twice. How she could pull that off, we don't know, but she did. The phone went dead the first time after a very brief conversation, maybe less than a minute, and she called him back. And she said to him, "What do I tell the pilot to do?" Vintage Barbara, ready to take charge. She was in the back of the plane, huddled with other passengers, and we're told flight personnel and presumably the pilot. She said that they were armed with knives and box cutters, cardboard cutters. If they were armed with other weapons, such as machine guns or any kind of gun, you'd think she might have said that first, but she said no, knives and box cutters. I asked Ted, did she tell you how many people were there, how many hijackers were there? And Ted said no, but she referred to them in the plural, so there was more than one. What about nationality? Did you get any sense of that? No. Motives? No.
They were all in the back of the plane, right, Tim? The pilots and the passengers were herded to the back of the 757.
That's the understanding I get from Ted, correct.
So whoever took over that plane was up front, and one of them had to know how to fly it.
Presumably that's the case, but you know, that's speculation and we don't know for sure. It's conceivable there was a co-pilot who still may have been in the cockpit. We don't know, but there were flight personnel and most of the passengers huddled in the back. Incidentally, Barbara was not supposed to be on that flight today. Her original plan was to fly to California yesterday. Today is Ted Olson's birthday, and she wanted to be with him last night, and so that was the cost.
And when she was on the phone, Ted had already known about the crashes in New York, right?
That is correct, and he did tell her about that, so she had a good idea of what she was up against. She knew about the two crashes at the World Trade Center.
Tim, you stay with us. Brian Jenkins, you're an expert on terrorism. You've been involved in things like this for a long time, but nothing compared to this. Were you shocked?
Shocked, but not surprised.
Not surprised?
Not surprised, no. The possibility of a large-scale terrorist attack on this country is something that we have anticipated for a long time. There have been previous incidents involving multiple coordinated attacks. We have dealt with previous situations where it was either threatened or certainly a concern of the authorities that a hijacked aircraft would be crashed into into the middle of a city.
But from what Miss Olson described them as having, how did they get on the plane with that?
Well, it depends. I mean, that's difficult to say, and we don't know. I mean, people do board aircraft with all sorts of small things.
And get on?
And potentially get on. I suspect that's going to change now, but I mean, people board aircraft with small penknives. They board aircraft with various kinds of metal objects. It does, however, raise some questions about how they were able to get on the aircraft and take control of the cockpit. This is not a standard hijacking where somebody seizes a passenger hostage and orders a pilot to fly to another city.
And in fact, in 3 of the 4 operations, they succeeded.
They did succeed.
The one that went down in Pennsylvania was obviously heading for Washington, is that correct? Something must have happened.
That's a safe presumption.
Arthur Woke, you're an expert at aviation accidents. You've been involved in the courts, often dealing with this, and we understand you're quite angry at this. Why?
Well, because to me, it's disgusting to hear the platitudes of the politicians inside the Beltway saying that the government is in charge. I thought the government was in charge this morning. Where was the government yesterday, 5 months ago, or a year ago when this was unfolding? Where were the national security agencies that are supposed to protect us from this? Where are our allies who are supposed to be part of this anti-terrorist network? Why are there no sky marshals on aircraft anymore? Was that a budgetary consideration of the FAA? Maybe that could have stopped it. So what bothers me, Larry, is that we're talking about burying what may be 25,000 people. There weren't supposed to be any more Pearl Harbors. We put in place a system to prevent this from happening. This was not a minimal terrorist act. This was something that required the cooperation of many, many people. And I don't understand, and I'm sure many of our viewers don't understand, how this could possibly happen. Where was the government?
All right, before I have Brian respond, Tim O'Brien, I know you're a reporter, so you're going to be objective about this. Does Mr. Wolk have a point?
I think he does have a point. How much of a point depends on perhaps where you sit. Certainly there are some security breaches here. One of your guests pointed out that we haven't had a terrorist hijacking in 10 years, and maybe we have gotten a little lax. But we also have to recognize when people are willing to give up their lives to stage something like this, it's going to be very hard to stop under any circumstances.
And Brian, what do you make of what Arthur said? I mean, obviously, there was a failure today.
There clearly was a failure, no question about it. We have to determine what happened with regard to intelligence, what happened with regard to security. But at the same time, we have to realize that there is an ongoing war, that there's a constant flow of information, threats, warnings, information passed on by intelligence agents. And many times, by evacuating an embassy, by issuing an alert, by raising the level of security, these attacks are thwarted. Those victories are invisible because you can't count things that don't occur.
So we could have averted 14 things last month. We didn't know about it.
It is entirely possible. What we do see, and certainly saw dramatically today, are the failures. When the intelligence fails, when the security fails, that's what we were faced with today. Can we get better on security? Yes. Can we provide absolute security? Absolutely not.
Arthur, you know, as I quoted earlier, if someone wants to give up their life, that's awful hard to contain, isn't it?
Larry, I think I agree with that. I think that we are supposed to have a system in place to prevent this from happening. And you can't stop terrorism at the gate at the airport. You stop terrorists before they enter the country. You stop them by investigating their cells when they're in the country. You avoid this by exercising as much security operations as you possibly can. I'm no expert in security. I'm just a guy who saw it on CNN Live today. And all I can tell you is that there weren't supposed to be any of these in this country, and the people who are supposed to have been in charge were asleep at the switch, in my opinion.
And also, since you're an expert on pilots and things, were you surprised that whoever did this was able to commandeer these aircraft?
Not really.
To fly them?
Not really. Remember, we have no sky marshals on the aircraft, so we have no one armed on aircraft randomly to prevent this from happening. The door that separates the cockpit from the rest of the airplane is really just a symbol of security. It's not real security. And finally, it doesn't take someone who's a rocket scientist to fly an airplane once it's airborne and to fly it into a building. So you don't have to be a sophisticated pilot to accomplish this, sadly.
All right, let's do what we haven't done yet today, and since this is a special edition of Larry King Live, and we'll be doing this, of course, throughout the week in CNN 24 hours a day, let's include the audience. Knoxville, Tennessee, hello.
Yes, sir, Mr. King. I was wondering what you and the panel thought about the possibility of the United States Army shooting down the plane over Pennsylvania. I know the Pentagon has denied it, but if they knew for D.C., is it possible that they did? And if they didn't, would they have later if it had gotten farther?
Yeah, Tim, this is supposing. A plane's heading in. It's got passengers. It's going to go to the White House or to Camp David. Do you shoot it down?
If there's that threat, you may have to, but certainly there are steps that can be taken before that threat materializes. First, you try to make contact with that plane, find out where it's going. But if it appears headed for the White House or the Pentagon or the Capitol or Camp David, and it's off route, that may be the only alternative you have, and it would make sense.
You agree, Brian?
In some cases, yes. The reality, however, in terms of major urban areas, airports are located in urban areas. Planes take off. It's not a long flight from Dulles to the Pentagon. It's not a long flight from some of the airports in the northeastern part of the United States to New York.
How about the caller, though? You've got a plane, you know it's diverted. It's obviously not going to San Francisco.
That certainly is one of those horrible decisions that someday I suppose someone is going to have to make.
St. Louis, hello.
Hello. My question is, we seem to have become very complacent, and we're being very sophisticated and very rational about how to respond to this. However, on all of the channels, and especially on CNN, which, by the way, I think has done a fabulous job, Osama bin Laden seems to be the prime suspect here. We've heard his name for years, and he continued to operate. And my question is, he supposedly 3 weeks ago gave notice that this was going to happen. where was everyone? Who dropped the ball? I know there's only so much you can do, and you said they might have averted 14 other incidents last month, but no one averted this incident.
Tim, was that a fact? Did we know that bin Laden had made some sort of threat 3 weeks ago?
There was knowledge that he made some kinds of threats, but they were general, and there was nothing new about that. He's making threats all the time. I think this may underscore the point made by Senator Feinstein earlier in the show, that it's not just an attack or a war that we must declare on individual terrorists, but rather on terrorism itself. Wherever it exists, the United States and other countries should be working to eradicate it, root and branch, or sooner or later it may strike home, as
Brian?
it did today.
I agree that Osama bin Laden certainly does make threats all the time. We can shut down the country. I mean, the number of threats coming in from Osama bin Laden, not just Osama bin Laden, but other organizations against the United States, is a continuing flow of information. There probably has not been a day in the last 10 years when there were not terrorist threats made against the United States somewhere in the world.
And Larry, that's just the point, you see. That's just the point. Terrorism didn't start yesterday. It didn't start last year. In fact, we both remember for the last 30 years or 40 years we've been talking about the seriousness of terrorism. It's really about time that we get our act together so that we don't wring our hands after the terrorist act has already occurred and people have lost their lives. We're supposed to be able to prevent this stuff. You know, they call it the 21st century threat. Well, it may be the 21st century threat, but we have the 21st century capability to deal with this threat. And obviously we're not
Are you saying, Arthur, every flight in America should have secret people on board watching the flight, that it should be treated as El Al treats every flight?
If that's what it takes, then that's what we have to do.
Indianapolis, hello.
Good evening, Larry.
Hi.
Like many Americans, I watched in horror from work today, all day long. My question, actually the question I was asked by my 13-year-old when she got home from school, is this going to change our entire way of living? Not in the sense of being afraid, but what about fuel prices? Today I went to work, gas was $1.62. I come out of work, it's $3